Welcome to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast with Tom Rosenbauer, bringing you tips, tricks, and techniques to help you get the most from your time on the water. Here's acclaimed fly fishing author and lifelong fly fishing enthusiast, Tom Rosenbauer.
Welcome to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast. This week, let's talk about nymphs, which reminds me of a story. Back in the early 1970s, Ernest Schwiebert came out with his monumental book on nymph flies and nymph fishing. And when the book first came out, they sold thousands of copies right off the bat. And the books just flew off the shelves of the wholesalers. A couple weeks later, most of them came back because the owners of the adult bookstores were a little bit disappointed when they opened the book and found it to be full of drawings of bugs and not something else. So anyway, that's my story about nymphs. But nymph fishing is fishing a imitation of a larval insect, caddisfly, mayfly, stonefly, or an adult crustacean like a scud or a sowbug, little crustaceans that live in trout streams. And I think the most important thing in nymph fishing is that your fly drifts at exactly the same speed as the current, what's called a dead drift. There is one way of fishing nymphs, which we call the wet fly swing, which is really the easiest way of fishing them. You put on a fly, you throw it straight across the river, and you let it swing in the current. You might make a little upstream bend by flipping the tip of your rod upstream to slow down the swing a little bit. And this sometimes works. It works. Perhaps the fish think it's a real tiny bait fish swimming across the stream. Sometimes emerging insects will swim across the stream. Sometimes it just catches their attention. But for the most part, the natural bugs that we're trying to imitate don't swim. They drift, and they're pretty helpless in the current. So you need a way to get your fly to drift at the same speed of the current. And if you keep that in mind, I think you'll be a better nymph fisher. So how do you do that? Well, the easiest way, and the way that we did before strike indicators, was to try to cast the fly straight upstream. So you get in the current, you get below the fish, and you throw the fly straight up current. And once the fly lands, you'll be using a floating line in this situation. You watch the tip of your floating line or your leader on the surface of the water for any kind of pause or hesitation. When that happens, you set the hook very quickly. This works well, and it's nice and easy to cast, but it's quite tiring throwing the line straight upstream, and you have to strip line as it comes back to you, and you do miss a lot of strikes. But it is a nice, clean way of fishing, and when you can get away with it without fishing with weight or an indicator on the leader, it's very pleasant. If you are in a situation where you can see fish feeding in the current and you can sneak up on them with a small, lightly weighted nymph, it's a really fun way to fish, particularly in slower water where you see a visible fish. But most of the nymph fishing we do is what we call blind fishing, where you can't see a fish, you suspect there's a fish somewhere, and you try to intrigue them with a nymph. The easiest place to fish nymphs is in a riffle where there's some moving water. It's very, very difficult to fish a nymph in slow water, particularly straight upstream. But in riffles and faster runs, water that's maybe anywhere from 2 to 4 feet deep is a prime spot to fish a nymph. Now, if you do fish nymphs without an indicator, one of the best things you can do is what's called the tuck cast, developed by Joe Humphreys in Pennsylvania. And a little bit tough to describe here on a podcast, but as you come forward with the fly rod, you tuck the tip of the rod down very quickly. So right at the end of your power stroke, you take the tip of the rod and you flip it straight down toward the surface of the water. What that does is to drive your fly into the water before the leader and the line land. So it makes it go a little bit deeper, and it gives you a little slack on the end of the leader. The reason this is important is that most of the time when we're fishing nymphs, we don't get the fly deep enough and it doesn't move slow enough. There's some drag on the fly. The line or the leader are pulling it, and that's usually the reason fish don't take are nymphs. It's not because you have the wrong fly on, although that can happen at times. But presentation is very important. So anything we can do to slow down the fly so that it drifts at the same speed of the current and get it down a little bit deeper is going to help your nymph fishing. Now, fish seldom take flies right on the bottom because they can't see down. They're hovering just above the bottom typically, and all their food comes from above, or nearly all of it, and they don't look down. So ideally you want your fly to ride maybe a foot off the bottom. You can do that by adjusting your casting length or your casting direction, or adding weight to the leader. If you're hanging up on the bottom briefly every 4 or 5 casts, every half dozen casts, then you know you're fishing deep enough. If you're hanging up every cast, you got too much weight on, you're going to lose a lot of flies. It's going to be expensive. Orvis is going to make a lot of money on your fly purchases. So you want the fly to just tick bottom every once in a while. If you don't hit bottom, if that line or your strike indicator never hesitates, then you're probably not fishing deep enough. So what's the best way to fish nymphs? What's the easiest way? The easiest way is to use either a heavily weighted nymph like a beadhead fly and a strike indicator, or a less heavily weighted nymph and a little bit of tin shot or sink putty on your leader to help get the fly down and slow it down, and then a strike indicator. I know a lot of fly fishers don't like to hear this, but strike indicator is nothing more than a bobber for the most part. But it is also a drift indicator. A strike indicator is a foam, cork, yarn thing that you put on the butt section of your leader, and you usually put it about, if you measure the depth of the water, you make your strike indicator about twice that distance up from the fly on your leader. So if the water's 2 feet deep, you want to put the strike indicator 4 feet above the fly. If it's 4 feet deep, you want to put the strike indicator 8 feet above the fly, because you never have a fly that hangs completely straight down from the indicator. It's on an angle. So the various kinds of strike indicators. Some are easier than others. Some float better than others. Some are easier to cast than others. One of the ones I really like these days is called the thingamabobber, which is a sealed plastic ball with a little grommet on it, and you can just put it on your leader with a loop-to-loop connection. Floats forever, easy to see, holds the fly above the bottom. So if you got your strike indicator rig, you got your weight on the leader, you're all set to go. Find yourself a nice riffle that's about 3 or 4 feet deep. Usually riffles at the heads of pools are the easiest to fish with a nymph. And probably the best time is early in the morning, particularly on warm mornings. I find that early morning fishing with a nymph is often better than the middle of the day. And stand at the lower end of where you want to fish and throw that whole rig. It's not going to cast that well, not going to cast as beautifully as a nice slim wet fly or a dry fly, and lob it up there in the current about 45 degrees upstream, so not straight across and not straight up, but up 45 degrees. Try a little tuck cast if you can to drive the fly deeper, and then let that fly drift naturally under the indicator, and do everything that you can to keep that indicator flowing in the same current lane. If you look carefully, you'll see lanes of current going down. And whatever you can do to keep that indicator in the same current lane is going to keep your fly in the same current lane, so it's going to look more natural. So you can make a quick mend by flipping a little bit of line upstream with the tip of your rod after the fly lands. You can raise the tip of your rod and keep most of your fly line off the water, but watch that indicator and do anything you can to keep it floating in the same current lane. The other thing you can do is after the strike indicator gets even with your position and it starts to drift downstream, you can carefully feed out a little bit of slack line by wiggling your rod back and forth and extend your drift a little bit more. And anything that indicator does that doesn't look right, it might wiggle, it might make a quick dart upstream, it might just pause. Set the hook gently. Just raise the rod tip enough to tighten the line. We probably still miss a lot of the strikes when nymph fishing, but you're going to miss far fewer strikes when you're fishing with an indicator. The other thing you can do to learn how to nymph fish which I recommend to people, is to go to a lake or pond with sunfish or bluegills or yellow perch or a stream that's just got creek chubs or whitefish in it and fish a nymph there. If it's still water, you can still use an indicator and use it like a bobber and throw it out there, and often the fish will eat your nymph as it settles to the bottom. And if they don't take it then, just twitch that indicator a little bit. And you can get a sense for what it looks like when a fish takes a fly, because sunfish, panfish are a lot more eager to take your fly, and you get a lot more action and a lot more practice learning how to fish a strike indicator by fishing for panfish. The one thing that might really surprise you is when a big bass takes your strike indicator, because it's happened before. And if you want to learn how to fish without an indicator, do the same thing. Find a stream or a lake with some panfish in it, and learn to watch your leader and the tip of your line, and you'll see him hesitate when a fish takes it. The one added point on nymph fishing is that a lot of people, where it's legal, fish 2 flies on a nymph rig. And typically what you'll do is the upper fly will be a little bit bigger or a little bit heavier, and the lower fly is a smaller fly, so that you try 2 sizes at once. Generally the size of the nymph is more important than the color and even the general shape. So in a typical stream, you might put a big size 10 or big size 8 stonefly nymph on the upper fly and maybe make it a beadhead fly so it sinks well. Use it as an anchor. Then you take a piece of tippet material, usually 4 or 5X, tie that to the bend of that big nymph, just tie it right around the bend with a clinch knot, same as you'd tie on your fly, and then extend that thing 6, 8, 10 inches, that other piece of tippet material, and then tie a smaller fly on the end of that. Now you got to be careful. These things tangle easier than fishing a single fly. They're terrible when you get hooked in a tree, and when it's windy, they'll wrap themselves up in the indicator and the weight. So this is not always a pretty way of fishing, and it's sometimes a frustrating way of fishing, particularly if it's windy or you got a lot of trees around. But it's one of the most effective ways to catch trout when you don't really know what's going on. So that's our podcast on nymphs this week. If you want to spend a little money and buy a book, I've got a book called The Orvis Pocket Guide to Nymph Fishing available from Orvis or from your local bookstore. And if you don't want to buy the book, that's okay. I'll tell my wife we have to drink a cheaper bottle of wine next Friday night. But you can go to the Orvis site for free and go to orvis.com/nymphs and find a little bit of free information there on fishing nymphs. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Orvis Fly Fishing Guide podcast with Tom Rosenbauer. Since 1856, anglers worldwide have counted on Orvis to help them get the most from their time on the water. To learn more and to shop the world's finest fly fishing gear, including the award-winning zero-gravity Helios rod, visit www.orvis.com/podcast.